On a remote Scottish road, a car crashes. Minutes later, the vehicle explodes, killing 32-year-old passenger Claire Morris. She had much to look forward to. Just a year earlier, Claire and the driver, Malcolm Webster, had been married in a lavish ceremony.
This was the first person that she'd fallen in love with.
It seemed like a perfect match, but detectives would uncover much about Webster that Claire didn't know.
He groomed women through sympathy in relation to apparent terminal illnesses such as leukemia.
For over a decade, Malcolm Webster would be at the heart of the mystery. Was Claire's death a tragic accident, or had she been killed by a man made for murder?
Long before Malcolm Webster met Claire Morris, I think he was a murderer in preparation.
What made policeman's son Malcolm Webster the killer he became? Using expert digital imagery from a specialist forensic artist to show the changing faces of a killer, this series reveals the life, timelines and the red flags of those who will one day be investigated for taking a life.
Even from a very young age, Malcolm Webster was setting fire to everything he seemed to be able to get hold of. It is a worrying sign. It's telling us that there's something going wrong in the way he's thinking, in the way he's relating within his family already.
Malcolm Webster was a problem child, a fact which might surprise given his dad's job. He worked at the Metropolitan Police.
His father wasn't just a hugely successful man, he was head of the fraud squad, and that's a very particular type of professional perspective on things.
Dr. Donna Youngs is a forensic psychologist, a relatively new science, which reveals the red flags in a person's life, the ones which suggest they could become a killer.
There was something different about Malcolm Webster's father, and something different in the way he got treated.
And if we looked at his life as a timeline, there are so many incidents of fire that Webster was involved in.
That behaviour is very unusual in a child and something that we would certainly consider to be a red flag for the future.
So on scout trips, things had gone on fire and Webster was never far away. And that nickname he had, which there's a certain irony in, and the nickname was Pyro.
He would brag about his skill in setting fires, and he would set fire to things. And it is said that he did that to get attention and perhaps to try and make friends.
Was Malcolm Webster already developing traits that would lead him to kill?
We know that many murderers practice first. They may progress from fairly small crimes to fairly big ones.
As the younger of a pair of twins, Malcolm was forced to find ways to grab the limelight.
He was known to be attention-seeking. He always wanted attention, but he always seemed to want to get his own way as well.
One way he discovered he could get sympathy was by feigning illness.
He'd feigned the fact that he had a brain tumour, a life-threatening illness.
He would pretend to faint, and that probably got him the attention that he was craving at the time.
He had firstly had a lot of medical conditions which apparently miraculously disappeared, and no question faked medical illnesses for his own ends.
Certainly by the time he was around 17 years old, he was making up quite elaborate lies about his health. He had joined an amateur dramatic group, and the people in the group were convinced that he had a brain tumour, and he would often faint and become ill.
Leaving school without qualifications, Webster still had to find a path for himself in the grown-up world.
He decided at that time that he wanted to become a nurse, which isn't that surprising. His mum had been a nurse, but also there was the involvement with illness and drugs and the attention that he got from that.
I do think it's relevant that Malcolm Webster chooses to follow in his mother's footsteps. It tells us that he is seeking parental approval, but he realises he can't even begin to match up to his father, and so he doesn't even try.
Malcolm Webster, by his 20s, did have a winning way.
He was a charmer. He was a quintessential English gentleman.
Malcolm Webster makes a decision, possibly not a conscious one, to become the complete opposite of everything that his father is. And that means somebody who is very engaging, very charismatic, very interpersonally aware and presents himself very well. Now, this will have charmed many people, and we know it did.
By the early 90s, Webster was working in the Middle East.
By the time he's around 30 years old, he's left the UK and he's living and working in Abu Dhabi. And he's working, certainly in a nursing role, in a children's hospital. But things went very wrong for him there.
It was around now that Webster became associated with unsolved mysteries. Tragedy seemed to follow him.
There were 3 unexplained deaths of children under 6 years old in strange circumstances where he had been on duty every single time. And he was immediately asked to leave the hospital and was in fact escorted from the country. That's another big red flag.
Webster found himself back in the UK, but out of a job. He set about job hunting, but as he did so, nobody had the complete picture of nurse Malcolm Webster.
There are lots of things in there that in hindsight, maybe you'd look back and you think, though, that's strange. You know, we've got the fire setting and we've got the fake illnesses, and we've also now got this really quite serious suspicion about him in the hospital.
A suspicion which remained unspoken, unreported. So Webster managed to talk his way into a nursing job at a hospital in Guildford.
Here he is, a man who has developed a lot of interpersonal charm. What's he going to do? He's going to use those particular skills to try and achieve in a way that equates to the success of his father somehow, but he can't do it in the same way. So the way he has to do it is in underhand manipulation, using his charm.
One of those who would fall for his charms was Claire Morris, who Malcolm had met at a party in 1990. Claire's brother is Peter.
My first impressions of him was quite gregarious, quite a pleasant chap. Claire described him as a little bit roguish, but he seemed okay to me. Seemed fine. Claire was a nurse. She'd been a nurse for some years. She'd done all training in London and what have you. And she was up in Dulwich. She was sharing a house in Dulwich with some friends. And I believe that she met Malcolm at a party, after which the next day he came down and was showering her with flowers and gifts and what have you. He seemed a gentleman. He seemed the sort of person that Claire would be interested in, and it didn't take long for her to fall for him.
Malcolm and Claire formed quite a strong relationship together. He was clearly able to convince people that he was a nice person, a person that they wanted to spend time with. But I don't think that stretched to people outside of the relationship. And this is quite common with people like Malcolm Webster. They can be incredibly manipulative, especially when they focus on something that they want. Whether they can keep that manipulation up with other members in the family is more questionable.
He'd managed to sort of wind this spell over her, really. She was almost submissive to him, which was very un-Claire-like. And some other members of the family, some uncles and aunts and people, found him a bit, I think they described him as too good to be true.
He was, but Claire Morris knew nothing of his fake illnesses, fascination with starting fires, and the facts of what had happened on wards that he had worked on in the Middle East. Right now, the self-styled victim, Malcolm Webster, wanted most to be in total control of Claire Morris, and he knew how to do it.
He'd started drugging her the day before the wedding.
Malcolm Webster, almost as soon as he had met her, began to manipulate and control Claire. He wanted her money.
About 2 years in, he gets Claire to change her will, and he is the sole beneficiary. He gets absolutely everything.
And then there were the life insurance policies.
And we see during that time, Claire had 10 life insurance policies against her life and a big mortgage protection policy.
And that was even before the big day. It was in 1993, a year after the insurance policies were taken out, when the couple were married.
It was a very happy wedding. Met some family members I hadn't seen for years, as you do at these things. But it was a traditional Scottish wedding, had a bit of class to it.
And he managed to convince Claire that they could start a life together in Aberdeen. But of course what that would have done as well is isolate her from her support networks and her family. And being clearly the kind of controlling person that he was, that would have pleased him greatly. He may even have planned it that way.
Pan. She's got a microphone on. Oh, earthquake.
She was very fond of Scotland and that sort of environment, so it was no surprise. And the thought that she was being whisked away to a remote area didn't occur to me at all. She was with a man she loved, she was in an environment that she loved, and she was doing something that she loved.
And doing it a long way from her family and support network, Webster had her at his mercy. Oblivious to Webster's plotting, Claire remained devoted to her husband. He, meanwhile, was using his skills as a nurse to malevolent effect.
He'd started drugging her the day before the wedding.
During his nursing training, he would undoubtedly have learnt about the doses of different drugs, and of course he would also have learnt about the risks and the side effects. That's very calculating.
I think she knew there was something wrong, but she wasn't suspecting that she'd been sedated.
He was ready, willing and able to murder. Claire Morris's fate was in the hands of a man she knew truly little about. Superficially charming, but with a past involving pyromania and feigning life-threatening illnesses. A man she had signed over all of her money to.
The plan that Malcolm Webster puts in place is very elaborate, very detailed.
A plan which, to the well-being of his new wife, was fatal.
I found it absolutely astonishing that he was putting an act on. I mean, it was so utterly convincing, the performance.
1994, and Malcolm Webster, apparently devoted to Claire Morris, is in fact secretly sedating her on a daily basis.
Clearly she knew herself that there was something wrong within her, and Malcolm, he would sideline that and he would minimise it.
This is a classic case of, I suppose, gaslighting, making people believe that they are going mad. Of course, in the past, it would have been done by telling them they'd imagined things. But here we're seeing somebody who believes that she's becoming iller and iller and iller and isn't capable. She's tired, she's confused, she's forgetting things.
At the end of May 1994, Webster had decided that he was going to kill Claire. He gave her sedatives until she was unconscious, and then he carried her to the car, put the seat down so that as he was driving, nobody would be able to see that she was in the car.
He had found a site where he could drive the car into a tree, and he deliberately increased the dose of medication that he gave her in order to render her unconscious.
As it had been since he was a child, fire was to be his weapon of choice. Webster loaded cans of petrol into the boot.
So Claire's unconscious in the car. He goes to a fairly remote area and drives the car off the road, across the field and into a tree. He then gets out of the car, leaving Claire inside, unconscious, and sets fire to it. And of course, with the petrol in the bag, it's going to go up quite quickly.
He then proceeded to ensure that his new wife was burnt alive. If she was very lucky, she may have stayed unconscious as a result of those drugs. If she was not, then she died in agony.
When the emergency services arrived, Webster simply said that there was no one else in the car when it crashed. That lie was quickly exposed.
Some wonderful fireman had to do his best to get what was left of her up and into an ambulance. It's vile. And for that to happen to such a lovely person is just ridiculous. It's just vile.
Basically, what we had was a man who had planned this quite well. He decided he was going to stage a road traffic collision and effectively set the vehicle on fire with his wife in the passenger seat incapacitated and effectively burn her to death.
He gives a statement to the police the day after and seems to change his mind that, Claire was actually in the car. Maybe they thought that he was in shock when the car was in flames at the side of the road, but nobody asked any questions, and it certainly seemed at that time as he got away with it.
With Claire dead and nobody asking awkward questions, Webster cleaned up on the life insurance policies.
I think for Malcolm Webster, the money represents success, and it's a way that he can benchmark himself against his father, even now, even as an adult. It's a way of proving that he's as successful as his father.
The lying continued in a display of supposed grief at Claire's funeral.
Apparently he hadn't wanted to discuss the funeral, but I didn't know about that. And we went up to the funeral and he was sitting there in a big neck brace. And I think I put my arm on his shoulder, sort of in a comforting way and what have you, and he was just head down and all this sort of thing, looking very morose.
But it was all an act, the work of a consummate actor.
After Claire's death, this was supposed to be earth-shattering for him. In May of 1994, by the September, he had 2 other girlfriends. Apparently one was the daughter of the person who was doing the autopsy. So he was using that as access to find out what they'd found.
When satisfied he was in the clear, Webster felt confident to use the life insurance money and the proceeds of Claire's will. He bought himself a boat and sailed off into the sunset. To be precise, New Zealand.
And I think it's fascinating that we know that Webster actually sails himself to the other side of the world. It shows me very clearly that we've got somebody who, again, is out of touch with reality, is simply living out these particular stories. And here he is putting himself across the other side of the world to start another one.
Having accumulated significant wealth and benefited from Claire's death to the sum of well over £200,000, which in the 90s was a significant, this remains a significant amount of money, but he managed to squander that very, very quickly. So within 6 months of Claire's death, he found himself in a situation where he was pretty much empty in the bank, and so he was in this cycle of financial need, and he had a lavish lifestyle. He liked the good things in life, vehicles, the yachts, the whole package. So he was a man who was living well beyond his means.
Faced with being poor, Webster decided to get rich quick, making money through murder.
And he starts another relationship with another woman called Felicity Drum.
The fact that he had sufficient confidence in his own skin to go and effectively repeat what he did with Claire.
We know that this man not only was not horrified by what he'd done, but actually figured it worked so well and he'd got away with it that he would try it again when he needed a bit more cash.
It was a perfect plan from its inception through to execution. He got away with it, so why wouldn't he do the same again?
What sort of a man had Webster, as he approached his 40th birthday, become?
We're not dealing with somebody here who buys into any of the normal moral standards or even any of the normal social accepted codes of conduct that we see with many and most violent criminals even. We're dealing with somebody who long ago gave up on trying to compete within the normal context of life. He just couldn't compete as a child. So he threw every accepted code of conduct out the window. He only has his own code of conduct.
One which made him ready to murder again. Soon after their marriage, unsuspecting Felicity began feeling unwell.
Clearly, even in the very, very early stages of their relationship, he was putting his plan into action.
In the relationship with Felicity, he starts to repeat the pattern, almost exactly the relationship that he had with Claire. He starts giving drugs to Felicity. She starts feeling again vulnerable and tired and fatigued. Not only was he drugging her, the pattern of him getting Claire to take out multiple life insurance policies, he also did the same with Felicity, and he got her to change her will in his favour.
Less than a year after they met, they were married. Within hours of exchanging vows, Webster steered his plan towards another killer car crash.
Practically the first day after they got married, he gave her such a huge dose of sedative that she slept for 36 hours. That's an incredibly dangerous thing to do in itself.
She lost something like 36 hours of the honeymoon that she slept through.
But Webster didn't care. He didn't care about Felicity. He certainly didn't care about her family. He didn't even care about the child she was carrying.
During the period that he was drugging Felicity, she was actually pregnant, and he knew that, and he was still giving her the drugs. He had no care at all for her or for his own unborn child.
It was 1999. Seeking an insurance payout even before killing Felicity, Webster returns to his childhood modus operandi of causing harm.
On more than one occasion, almost certainly, during his marriage to Felicity Dunn, he had set fire or had laid fires. On one occasion, with his infant son and his wife and her parents, all asleep in the same house.
I think that he presumed that because he was going to do this in a remote area of New Zealand, that nobody would collate that to an accident that happened in Scotland. And he got Felicity insured for best part of $1 million, and he was going to gain quite financially.
In the New Zealand version of events, Webster was forced to improvise. He'd been raiding his second wife's bank account.
They were going to the bank, they were going to meet with their solicitors. And that was going to unveil the fact that he had no money in the account. He had embezzled money from her account. So he knew that that was not going to be a good meeting. So he was pretty much forced into that journey being the journey where he had to do this. So it wasn't so controlled, it wasn't the perfect murder, because he was never a suspect, because there was never a crime.
Auckland, and a failed attempt by Malcolm Webster to kill Felicity Drum.
The police came upon them, and he was stopped.
He maintained that the accident had been caused because the steering had been faulty. But of course the vehicle examination had uncovered that that wasn't the case.
Car crash investigator Mark Crouch has analysed the accident.
Webster's allegation in the second collision was that there was a defect with the steering that caused him to swerve across the road. It's highly unusual for a defect to the steering to cause a vehicle to veer violently across the road.
The petrol cans were found in the rear of the vehicle by Felicity's brother-in-law. There was a cigarette lighter found in the console of the vehicle. which was odd because neither of them smoked. There were scrunched up newspapers, and all of this led them to think that something really suspicious had happened.
They became very suspicious all of a sudden. Things weren't sitting right.
That vehicle was examined and there were no defects found with it. Furthermore, the defect that would have been present to explain the scenario as per his account would have been very obvious to find, and it would have been very, very prevalent, except there wasn't a defect found.
That was a pretty compelling and poorly executed attempt on Felicity's life.
Felicity started putting the pieces of the jigsaw together and started to make sense of some of the things that had been happening to her. The family and Felicity started looking at some of the financial transactions that had been going on, and it came to light that there were forged insurance policies. There had been money moving around that she knew nothing about, and such were their suspicions at that point that Felicity decided to go to the police.
Where she revealed details of the crash, the stolen money, and something else.
So she made a statement to the police about her suspicions, and she included in that she hadn't been feeling well. So they tested her hair, and as a result of those tests, they found out that she had been drugged for quite a long period of time.
The police in New Zealand had warrants issued in relation to his behaviour, so yes, he was absolutely on their radar in New Zealand. They were very clear in terms of their investigation that the prosecution were satisfied that there was sufficient evidence for an attempted murder in relation to his actions, and indeed the drugging of Felicity when she was pregnant.
The net was tightening on Malcolm Webster. He was left with only one option: to again run away.
I think Webster was very aware that Felicity was suspicious of him.
Once the house of cards began to tumble in New Zealand and he realised that the game was up, he had to get out of there.
And by the time the police issued the arrest warrants, he'd already left the country and come back to the UK.
He'd got away with it once and escaped the law at his second attempt. Would he try again? In August 2004, Webster, still technically married to Felicity Drum, started a relationship with a woman called Simone Banerjee.
And the pattern started to repeat itself all over again.
Why did he feel the need to return to marriage in order to murder?
Malcolm Webster sees himself as the victim of lifelong circumstances. So whenever any possible opportunity presents itself to him, he sees no reason not to exploit that. He won't have seen what he's doing in terms of the harm, the violence, the murder that he's committing. He will simply have been seeing it in terms of the extent to which it feeds himself.
Malcolm Webster had killed his first wife, almost murdered his second, and was now back in the UK on the hunt for a new target.
Effectively went into phase 3 of his life, if you like. It wouldn't be too difficult to draw some conclusions, potentially, of what was going to be the outcome.
He made promises to marry her, he wanted to be in this committed relationship with her, but he failed to mention that he was still married to Felicity. He had not gone through divorce proceedings with her.
In his third potential victim, we see a woman who was unaware that he was not yet free to marry again, and he tried to persuade her to write a last will and testament without having to go through the bother of marrying her, leaving everything to him.
Recalling his childhood tendency to fake illnesses, Webster lied to Simone. He said that he had terminal cancer.
We know that he groomed women through sympathy in relation to apparent terminal illnesses such as leukemia. And in fact, he went to the extent of apparently going for chemotherapy, and in absence from the family home, he was actually engaging with other women. But he would return home with his head shaven, his eyebrows shaven, apparently as part of his chemotherapy.
He made himself lose an awful lot of weight. And this was all a big manipulation to, one, get her to feel sympathy for him so that she would stay in this relationship with him. But it also allowed him to have an excuse, if you like, to start asking her for money.
He was driven by a personality which prepared Malcolm Webster to do what it took to get his way.
Anything to get some kind of attention. These people do not care in the way that other people care about social rules, and they don't care about other people because they just don't have the emotional wherewithal to care about other people because everything is focused on themselves.
He even managed to convince Simone to change her will, again, in his favour, should she die before him.
He'd succeeded before, would he do so again? But then a remarkable chance meeting sparked a new line of inquiry.
The decision in 2008 to actually re-energise the investigation was largely down to the chance visit in England between Felicity's sister and the police officer.
Felicity's sister, Jane, was in the UK for a conference about domestic abuse. She happened to tell a CID officer the story of the attempted killing in Auckland and that she believed Webster was now in Scotland.
What Jane wanted to do while she was in the UK was seek out Webster and confront him. And she was angry with him. This was there'd been no justice at all, and she wanted to go and she wanted to confront him. The police advised her against that, and I think at that point is when they decided that they were going to do some digging, they were going to do some investigating, and they took a statement from Jane.
So the coming together of the sister and the police officer in England was fortuitous. Thankfully, the police officer was sufficiently convinced about the account to contact Grampian Police in Scotland.
Scottish police, now suspicious about the death of Claire Morris, wrote a letter to warn Simone.
When it became known that they were about to embark on a fairly lengthy yacht trip around the Canaries, that's when the decision was taken that something had to be done. And so there was an intervention through what we call an Osman warning, where if the police become aware of intelligence that they believe that someone's life is in danger, then you're obliged to advise and notify that individual. Simone was warned that there was a genuine belief that she was in a relationship with a dangerous individual who had a history that would suggest that she needed to think very carefully about continuing that relationship.
Simultaneously, police launched an investigation into the death of Claire Morris.
Malcolm Webster's story really started to unravel.
2009 in Aberdeenshire, Scotland, and police get ready to make their move against Malcolm Webster. They trawl through his past, decide that a review of the death of his first wife, Claire Morris, was vital. Amongst others, they interview his former in-laws.
It's pretty earth-shattering because in 1994, when Claire died, one of my ways of coming to terms with it was that it was an accident, first and foremost, and Claire unluckily was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and there was an air of fate about it. Suddenly all this turns up, and I've got to accept that it wasn't actually fate. It could well have been avoided. It was a deliberate setup. And it starts making you wonder whether white is black or something like that. You know, I went through a period where I really didn't trust anybody with anything. You know, it was took a long time to come to terms with.
The circumstances of the road traffic accident involving Claire were remarkable, and the circumstances in New Zealand involving the road traffic accident with Felicity were remarkable, but when you overlaid and put the two together, they were compellingly striking in terms of the similarities. And so that largely was the catalyst for another wave of investigation
But suspicions and remarkable coincidences were not enough to win a conviction for murder.
It needed more than that. It needed something tangible, something solid.
Science became crucial.
They had kept some tissue samples from the first accident.
The pathologist, Dr. James Grieve, he did have a meticulous record of what had happened in the original post-mortem. And had he not had the foresight to gather these samples and retain them over the years, then there wouldn't have been that piece of evidence that was the catalyst to ignite the second wave of police investigation. And that was a bombshell.
The sliver of tissue from Claire's crash revealed high levels of sedative in her body.
With the passage of time and the advance of science, the toxicology around that was remarkable.
We're talking about a thousandth of a gram, tiny piece. And they found a way of dividing that and testing it for unnatural substances. And that with this new method they invented to try it, they found temazepam in that sample, and that it was a 90-something% chance that it was temazepam. And that is not something that could be naturally in there from the body generating it. It would have to be planted there.
There was indeed scientific evidence that there was sedative in that liver tissue, which then, of course, entirely changed the circumstances of the original road traffic collision.
Lots of people consider car crashes to be accidents, just another thing that happens. But in the case of a very serious collision, where somebody has lost their life, they get looked at, murder scene or any other case where somebody gets very significantly injured. Collision investigation is a forensic science, and sometimes people forget that.
Webster claimed the car had swerved off the road and hit a tree before catching fire.
He said that he'd swerved to avoid a motorcycle.
But the speed of impact told a different story.
You would expect the vehicle to lose control at or about the speed limit for the road. It doesn't lose a lot of speed in the time that it's leaving those curve marks as it's travelling across the road and eventually into the thing that it hits. So it would be slightly unusual to end up with quite a low speed impact at the end of a swerve or an evasive manoeuvre.
Investigators concluded that the car was driving too slowly to have caused Claire's death and the subsequent fire.
Cars catching fire as a result of a collision are a bit of a rarity. It's more Hollywood than real world. There were witnesses that described the fire took hold of the vehicle 15 or 20 minutes after the original collision. We have a low speed impact and a late onset of a fire. That would be very unusual.
We know from witnesses that he had visited the location in the days leading up to the accident, so he'd effectively recce'd the location. At the predetermined location, he drove the vehicle off the road at a very low speed, did impact with a tree with the front of the vehicle, and then emptied petrol fuel in the vehicle, set it on fire. And then passers-by effectively intervened. But remarkably, he maintained at least one, possibly two of the first witnesses who arrived on the scene, because the question was asked, is there anybody else in the vehicle? And he was adamant no.
They were very, very cleverly spun lies. Very calculated and very clever. And they were there to achieve your trust, they were there to achieve your confidence, and they did that.
He actually had the confidence in his own actions to prevent any potential rescue of Claire by the passers-by, which again gives you a depth of insight into how callous this man is.
But as we all know, he had no feelings of guilt. He doesn't have any feelings of guilt. So despite the fact that he's done that despicable thing, he got no guilt on it.
Now, nearly 15 years on from Claire Morris's death, there was solid, tangible evidence to add to the suspicions, But was it enough to convict Malcolm Webster of murder? Webster, at that stage still to be approached by police, called Detective Alan Smith, complaining that he, Webster, was being harassed.
I took a phone call from Webster, who had heard that there was investigations ongoing into the death of Claire, and he was highly indignant. He was pseudo-aggressive in terms of how could you possibly think that I could be involved in anything to do with Claire's death. Very dramatic phone call. Definitely a determined phone call to try and convince somebody on the other end of a phone that he wasn't involved. It struck me as being somewhat pathetic that somebody might think that they could, in a phone call, just douse down the interest in a murder investigation.
It was another example of Webster's front, his cocky belief in himself as a master manipulator.
It was a bizarre phone call, when all it really did was add fuel to the fire, in the sense that gave us more determination that such were the actions. It was bizarre. He
was very confident of his own intelligence, his own planning. He thought that he had covered all the bases, but actually this wasn't a clever man. This was a manipulative man.
Having built a persona around himself, possibly to escape his father's domineering shadow, Malcolm Webster had created a monster, himself.
Because that's what it was. His whole life, adult life, was nothing other than a performance. He was into amateur drama as a young man, and I think he played that through for the rest of his days. I think he lived his life in a complete fantasy, and he was successful in many ways in terms of his goal of making money out of that.
The deadly charade was to come crashing down at his trial for the murder of Claire Morris, the attempted murder of Felicity Drum, and the bigamous attempt to marry Simone Banerjee.
The whole pattern of behaviour by Webster was well described by the judge who summed up in his trial when he described it as being like a 1,000-piece jigsaw that was strewn across the floor. And until such time as the jigsaw was put together, not just by the police but by family, by friends, there was a whole network who helped put this jigsaw together.
You can't start the process of grieving until you've got the truth. And that's why I say that my mother and I had to grieve twice for Claire. It was a reopening of the scar, because you can't move on or do anything in life until you've got that truth. That's imperative.
Webster was found guilty of his crimes in May 2011 and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 30 years. After 2 appeals and a review, he remains in prison, still protesting his innocence.
He's never shown remorse, he's never admitted his guilt. He maintains his innocence to this day.
From the beginning, the telltale danger signs were there in the character of Malcolm Webster. Behind the calculating, callous facade, he was truly a man made for murder.
Malcolm is a psychopath. He can put himself into a bubble when he's committing a crime, and he can completely detach himself from what he's doing whilst he's doing it.
I think we can look back as far as his childhood at the feigned brain tumour, at the fake fainting episodes at school, and see there the roots of somebody who would do anything to get what he wanted.
也不贵，都是10几块钱、20几块钱的码字本。 市，它这里开了好多年了。不过它每隔几年就会店面升级一次，这是这2年升级的。那今天是4月7号，才过完清明节的。过完清明节，武汉的天气就果然不一样了，又暖和又明亮了。果真是清明节之后就天清气明了。这几个新疆人在这里开了很多年了。陆老秧酸菜鱼在这里保底开了有20年了吧。也开了很多年了。回民烧烤。这里叫弯弯烟酒，在这里起码开了20-30年是有的。我每次从这里走，我还要着重的看一下这个招牌。这条街的烟火气息实在是太浓烈了。走在这个街上，就是